Phyllis Reynolds Naylor. Naylor was born January 4th, 1933 in Anderson, Indiana, to a religious family with conservative Midwestern values. And because her father was a traveling salesman, Phyllis never considered any place home. There were two places her family would vacation to every summer: Iowa or Maryland. Both sets of grandparents lived on farms, but personalities and environments were very different. Grandparents from Iowa, which were her mother's parents, were business owners. Serious and reserved, hugs were reserved for arrivals and departures only. Her grandparents in Maryland were outgoing and friendly. Her grandfather was a church pastor and her grandmother a midwife. Naylor's times in Maryland were livelier. One constant in Naylor's early life was storytelling and reading. Though she grew up during the Great Depression of the 1930s and her family did not have a lot of money, Naylor never felt poor because her family owned books. Her parents enjoyed reading stories to the children. Her father would imitate the characters in Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And her mother read to them every evening, almost until they were old enough to go out on dates, though she never would have admitted this to anyone. Mark Twain became her favorite author. Phyllis eagerly began writing her own story in grade school. One rule her parents had: Phyllis was not allowed to use new sheets of paper for writing or drawing. So every day after school, she would search the wastebaskets at home for discarded paper that had one side blank. She would staple the paper together and use colored paper strips to cover the staples to give it a bonded book look. And she would also cut up envelopes in half and glue them on the side covers as pockets with an index card to check out her stories to friends and neighbors. By the age of 16, she began writing stories and poems for a church paper. She decided to send her stories to widely read magazines such as Jack and Jill and Heights for Children. Because her stories were rejected and returned to her, her dreams of fame and fortune had vanished. In 1951, at the age of 18, she got married, and after graduating from Juilliard Junior College, she moved with her husband to Chicago, where he worked on an advanced degree. She found a job as a clinical secretary at the University Hospital and then taught third grade for 6 months on a temporary teaching certificate. When Naylor was 23, her husband began to display symptoms of mental illness. She felt great pressure to write stories in order to pay for their rent and other expenses. One day, while living in Chicago, her husband suddenly showed signs of severe mental illness. For 3 years, Naylor had moved from state to state, hospital to hospital to continue to write to support her and her husband. Sometimes she would take an afternoon and go off to a remote spot just to brainstorm. Writing down ideas, however, they occurred to her until finally she had a list of plots to see her through the next few months. Finally, after moving her husband to a hospital in Maryland, she was hired as a typist by the Board of Education's psychology office in Rockville, and then worked a year for the Montgomery County Education Association. Eventually, she lost hope that her husband would recover from his disease, diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, and decided to divorce him. The laws at the time made this difficult procedure because they required that her husband be declared incurable. Meanwhile, she fell in love, and when she succeeded in divorcing her first husband, she married Rex Naylor, a speech pathologist, on May 26, 1960. By this time, Naylor decided to return to school and become a clinical psychologist. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from American University. But she knew then she still wanted to be a writer. She canceled her plans for graduation school and became a full-time writer and began a family. She wrote a column about family life for a church magazine and also a humorous column for teenagers that continued for 25 years. Phyllis Naylor, an accomplished author, celebrated both for her versatility and for her diversity of her works. She is a creator of novels, short stories, picture books, and nonfiction for children and adults, as well as fiction, in a number of genres and styles, such as historical fiction, the gothic novel, the mystery story, the time travel, fantasy, and the problem novel. Her works range from young adult novels and sensitivity treat serious issues to humorous, lightheaded stories for younger children. As an author of nonfiction, Naylor writes instructional books about such subjects as relationships and writing as a profession. In the former category, Naylor provides techniques for effective interaction with parents, siblings, teachers, and friends while stressing communication, tolerance, and self-understanding. Naylor's fiction usually features young people who face adverse situations and interferes to find personal strength and grow toward maturity. Addressing moral, religious, psychological, and family issues, she writes about such subjects as mental and physical illness, loss of faith, crib death, war, and sex. Consequently, some of her books have been regarded as controversial. Although she often writes about the difficulties of living, Naylor presents young readers with a positive, optimistic view of life and a philosophy that stresses acceptance of both self and others. In 1965, Naylor published her first book, a short story collection called The Galloping Goat and Other Stories. Her first children's novel was What the Gulls Were Singing, appeared 2 years later. Since then, she has published one or more books each year. In her biography, Naylor describes her writing process. She gets an idea for a book. She writes down the name on masking tape and places it on a spine of a large 3-ring notebook. She has a chair near the bookshelves where she keeps these notebooks. Anytime she gets an idea, she jots it down in the notebook. She keeps pictures, maps, pages from telephone books, newspaper clippings, anything that will help her write her books. When she knows she's ready to write a book, she is out on her morning walks. With a clipboard on her lap, she writes out her first scene or chapter, and so on. She rewrites each chapter to make it better, so by the end she has 2 copies written in longhand. After rewriting, revising, and a small group of authors critique it, and after the publisher makes their suggestions, she'll revise it a final time. After time had passed, Naylor wrote about her painful experience of having a loved one become mentally ill. In 1977, she wrote an autobiographical account of marriage and madness, where she wrote that she felt and went through living with a paranoid schizophrenic. She used this experience to write a novel for adults, Crazy Love. In her 1987 young adult novel, The Keeper, she imagines a teenage boy's reactions to his father's mental illness. Nick sees his father become paranoid and distrustful and attempts to help him, but finally struggles to convince authorities that his father needs to be admitted to an institution. The book was well regarded for its insightfulness and believable portrayal of Nick's responses and emotions. In How I Came to Be a Writer, she writes her successes and failures, reviews and rejection slips, things that mark the stages of a writer's life. Illustrated with photographs and including samples of her early writing, this book will show you the inner workings of the writing process, from the spark of an idea to a book's actual publication. For this book, she received IRA Children's Choice Award and Golden Kite Award. A string of chances. During the summer, she spends with a married cousin. The 16-year-old daughter of a small-town preacher not only discovers secrets which divide her family, but experiences for the first time uncertainties about her life. For this book, she received the South Carolina Young Book Award. In Maudie in the Middle, it introduces a young girl growing up in Iowa in the early 1900s. Maudie, to attract nothing but trouble when all she wants is to be noticed for herself, and when a crisis hits the family, she finally accomplishes this in the best way possible. For this book, she received Society of School Librarians International Book Award. In Keeping a Christmas Secret, 4-year-old Michael finds a way to redeem himself after he mistakenly tells Dad what the family is giving him for Christmas. For this book, she received the Christopher Award. In Sin, No Blessings, a teenager in a large family that lives in a trailer yearns for love, approval, and escape from endless chores, and a chance to make something of herself. When a good and decent man, 7 years her senior, falls in love with her, she realizes marriage to him could solve her problems. This book she received a ALA Notable Book Award. In The Agony of Alice, Phyllis Reynolds Naylor lively, witty style mixed the poignancy and perception that she captured the essence of adolescent anxieties as we follow Alice through the trials and tribulations of growing up. For this book, she received an ALA Notable Book Award, also IRA Children's Choice Book Award. Last but not least, her Newbery Award-winning book, Shiloh. When a beagle follows him home, Marty, from a West Virginia family with a strict code of honor, learns a painful lesson about right and wrong. Sequels include Shiloh Season, Saving Shiloh. Thank you.